Hello. Good evening and welcome. We're so pleased tonight to have Jack Shoba with us to tell us a little bit more about the native plants of our prairie. It's such an interesting little fact that a little bit of prairie that was enclosed as a cemetery over 150 years ago wound up enclosing just a little bit of the native heritage of the state of Illinois. And we're so pleased as a congregation to support that and very interested to learn more about it here tonight. Here tonight to tell you just a little bit more about some of the group that cares for the prairie is one of our members, Debbie Kuhlman, who's also Darien Citizen of the Year this year.
I'm just would like to introduce the people who work there every week from May until the middle of October, so you guys stand up. There's somebody from this group at the cemetery every week from May through October. For the last, they've been there for 3 years working in the prairie, so, and Denise and Kristen at the end. Denise stays after we leave, so she stays 2 or 3 hours after we leave. She and Kristen have come back on the weekends, worked with a chainsaw. Kristen took off 300 stumps in the prairie, or we more affectionately call them trip hazards. And we've emerged from the prairie with covered in avens and stickweed and brambles and all kinds of stuff. And we always have lunch afterwards. We bonded. We have a really good group. You're welcome to join us any Thursday you want from 9 until noon. Bring a lunch. Thank you.
Yeah.
The cemetery is located at the corner of 67th and Clarendon Hills Road.
Illinois is the prairie state. You may not know that, but almost all of the prairie in the state of Illinois has been replaced by corn, bean fields, and subdivisions. But by a historical quirk of fate, a tiny bit of the unused prairie remains in Darien, in the cemetery here of St. John Lutheran Church, which, as Debbie said, is Clarendon Hills Road and 67th Street. Starting in 2002, this small group of volunteers here, realizing that the prairie was rapidly deteriorating and being taken over by weeds, gathered together to restore that section of prairie, and they've continued to meet every week since. One of those volunteers is our educator and photographer here, Jack Shuba, who's a retired science teacher from Lyon Township High School and the Morton Arboretum. Long active in prairie preservation, he will share stories of how the prairie fits into the history of Illinois, how it was nearly obliterated, and how a small group of dedicated people can rescue a part of our native natural heritage. Let's give a warm welcome to Jack Shuba.
Thank you. I'm testing the sound. How's that? Louder. Testing. Testing 1, 2, 3. Is it okay? Okay. This is too high tech for me. The picture is there. The advance is back there. So if I do that. So I got interested in prairie many years ago. And it was tricky to learn what a prairie was because a prairie is treeless, but lots of places are treeless and they're not prairies. And I decided you really need to see a prairie through the seasons. I mean, you see a mountain and you know what it is. You see a seashore, you know what it is. The prairie, if you see it once, you really haven't seen it because it changes through the season. Our woodland wildflowers bloom a little while and they're gone, but the prairie flowers bloom all summer long. And so it takes a little work to figure out exactly what a prairie is. So anyway, I'm thinking about how to explain to people, and part of it to me is the history of it. So besides just the plants, the history of the prairie. Are some of you from the Historical Society? See some heads nod. So we've got some history in here besides just the biology. So you're seeing up there the Prairie Reverie, that's in the Prairie School font. So we even have a font named for the prairie. So I call this first section of it Prairie Reverie. Emily Dickinson said, to make a prairie, it takes one clover and a bee, and reverie, the reverie alone will do if bees are few. I have no idea what that means. If there's an English teacher here, maybe. Emily Dickinson never saw a prairie. She lived out east, she didn't travel. She's not talking about a prairie there, in what I think of as a prairie. I had to talk to my old professor, Google, and found out that it probably means the prairie symbolizes something complex. And to make something complex, you can start with some simple ingredients and an idea. And if you don't have the ingredients, the idea of it is what really counts. So this is my reverie. So we'll imagine that that my name is Prairie, and I was Prairie born because my mother went to the Prairie obstetrician. And I went to preschool, and I went to elementary school, and I went to middle school, and I went to junior high, and I went to high school. And guess where I went next? College. So I went to college, and I majored in popcorn and beer. So I didn't really know what I wanted to study. But then I found out these are celebrated American breasts engineered by silicon to be as broad and bountiful as the prairie. So I thought, I've got to study prairie. So I studied prairie music and how, punctuation prairie, and some of you may recall the vacant lots in Chicago were called Prairie. And I studied spelling. Fermilab spells prairie that way, and the Morton Arboretum spells it a different way. So who's smarter, the physicists or the botanists? Well, let's find out. How do you spell prairie? Well, Rand McNally spells it both ways. I grew up just off the top right corner of this picture, just very near Prairie Street, and that's the sign for Prairie Street, just outside of Sugar Grove. Well, you can't trust road signs, and I certainly can't trust my GPS in my car. If I want to find a prairie, I type P-R-A, enter, because you don't know how they're going to spell it from there on out. It drove me crazy. It just drove me crazy. I had to go to my counselor. Well, after college, I bought a vehicle, and I got a rental place. And then I looked for a job. And I got in on the ground floor of the Silicon Prairie and the E-Prairie and the Prairie Web, got in the ground floor and made a ton of money. I invested it, and my advisor said, buy some prairie dogs. And I made enough money that I was able to move out to the Fox River because they had the wild prairies out there. And sure enough, we have a wild prairie out there. So I went to my Prairie Field real estate agent, and I said, I'm looking for a house. And they said, I've got a little house on the prairie, but it was too small. I said, I need something bigger. Well, we have big houses on the prairie. We have Hampshire Prairie, and that's on Prairie View Parkway there, with Native Prairie, Sunset Prairie, Prairie Commons Creek, Crossing, Glen, Highlands, Knoll, Lakes. Lane, meadows, point, ponds. Oops. I think I went too fast here. Let me see if I can back up. Maybe not. Oh, there we go. So the one on the left does have a view of prairie. You can see the prairie there, right there at the base of it, the prairie flowers there, the liatris. Your job, should you accept the challenge, is to find out how many places are called Prairie View. I've not counted them, so it's up to you. So there's 3 to start off with. Come on here. So I decided to buy some land and build my own house. So I went to the bank and got a loan, and I lined up all my construction people, and I built a house with the prairie kitchen and bathroom. And I'm in a nice neighborhood. There's a lot of shopping centers nearby. And any kind of a store you want. And parks nearby, that's nice. My recycling, that's good. I had a hard time picking a church, I have to say. There were so many choices of a church. But I went with Lutheran because they have the live bait machine. Well, I like to go out to eat now and then, but I eat good, good healthy prairie food, and I drink prairie drinks. But I like to do my own cooking, so I get my fresh produce. And my favorite recipe is I go out into the prairie and I gather the oranges and the cranberries from the prairie. But anyway, I've retired, which gives me time to participate in the prairie pleasures and treasures. So I took up golf and fishing and boating. And I wear prairie clothes so I can go hiking, so I can see the wild prairie grass. I like to go antiquing, but I've had a lot of health issues as I get older. It's just one thing after another. I mean, my teeth, unbelievable the trouble I'm having with my teeth. And it's one dentist after the other. All kinds of medical things. I couldn't believe the Prairie Bleeding and Clotting Center. I thought, what, is this a joke or what? So I Googled that, and it is a hematology place. It's a legitimate business, but they misspelled Prairie on the internet. Anyway, my dog got sick. And I eventually had to go into assisted living until I had that heart attack. And I ended up in a prairie repose. Now, there's only one thing I haven't seen in my life. A prairie. Good. A prairie. Well, it's interesting to me why we name so many things prairie. The word prairie has some magic about it, and it has associations with, outdoors and wild, open spaces and things, which we love our suburbs to pretend we're out in the wild. So let's look at what a prairie really is. So in 1840, Eliza Steele from out east wanted to visit a prairie, and she was in Chicago going down to Joliet, and she went down what is now Plainfield Road, so real close to where we are now. And she says, and she saw her first prairie, just a couple miles from where we are. I was in the midst of a prairie, a world of grass and flowers stretched around me, rising and falling in gentle undulations. What a new and wondrous world of beauty. What a magnificent sight. How shall I convey to you the idea of a prairie? And that's my problem. I want to figure out how to convey the idea of a prairie. And how I've chosen to do it is to do it through history. So we are the prairie state. We have a prairie symbolic, a prairie, official prairie grass, big blue stem. And we have big blue stem at our local cemetery, Prairie, but this picture isn't from there. My wife said, why don't you put a little dot by it? And so as I go through these pictures, if it grows at St. John Cemetery, but the picture was taken elsewhere, it'll have a dot. So big blue stem could have been taken there. Happens, it's this picture, wasn't it? Anyway, so there is no prairie garden at Garden Prairie, and the fancy prairie isn't very fancy anymore. But there would have been prairie at these places. These are old names, and there would have been prairie back then. It's not like all these stores and subdivisions and everything. These places would have had a prairie, but they don't anymore. Sadly, there is no prairie at the little house on the prairie. But there is a little prairie on a house in Naperville, Pat Armstrong's house. So what is a prairie exactly? It's a stable North American community dominated by grasses and adapted to drought and fire. It will have few or no trees and 200 to 300 species of native wildflowers and grasses. When we try to save prairies, some people say, what are you doing? You're trying to save those weeds? Well, a prairie plant is the opposite of a weed. So weeds are mostly non-native plants. There's a few native weeds, but mostly non-native. Most weeds are annuals or biennials. Weeds love disturbed ground, and they have shallow roots. Prairie plants, on the other hand, are all native, almost all perennials. Almost all of them love the undisturbed ground, and a very large number of them have deep roots. So weeds live fast and die young, and the prairie is slow and steady wins the race. Now you can't go by the word weed in the name. So 3 of these 4 have weed in their name, and 1 does not. And 2 of them, I could have taken the picture at St. John. The butterfly weed used to be there. We haven't found it yet. We keep looking. It may pop up this year, or we may reintroduce it, possibly. That's another whole other story. How many of these are actually weeds, would you say? one, right? The one that doesn't have weed in its name is the weed. And the ones that have weed in their name are prairie plants. So prairie owes its existence to the Rocky Mountains, which rose maybe 30 million years ago, and that blocked the wind coming across the continent from the west and left a dry area east of the mountains. But it picks up moisture from Canada and from the Caribbean, and so we end up with this triangle of prairie. And in the east, it's tall grass prairie, and the farther west you go, the drier it gets and the shorter the grasses get. But we and Iowa, particularly Iowa, pretty much originally covered with tall grass. So there was a lot of it, but it virtually all got destroyed. But I'm getting ahead of my story. Having trouble with this clicker. There we go. So prairie invaded Illinois about 8,000 years ago. We had a warm, dry period after the glaciers melted, like 13,000 years ago. About 8,000 years ago, it was warm and dry, and the prairie moved into Illinois from the west. And today, Illinois has enough rainfall to support forest. So we have kind of a mix, or had kind of a mix of prairie and forest, dependent on fire. So the next step in the history would be the Native Americans. You remember Massasoit? He was a friend of who? The Pilgrims, right? Friend of the Pilgrims. What is this you call property? It cannot be the earth, for the land is our mother, nourishing all her children, beasts, birds, fish, and all men. The woods, the streams, everything on it belongs to everybody. It's for the use of all. How can one man say it only belongs to him? Now we still have that concept. We say the air belongs to everybody. And water in the east, water belongs to everybody, not out west. And animals belong to the state. You don't own that fox that ran through your yard. But the land, it's mine. I bought it. I paid for it. So the Indians didn't have that concept, but thought that it belonged to everybody. So to illustrate the Native Americans, I've chosen this plant called a pacoon. And pacoon is an Indian word that means a plant that gives us a dye. And there are several colors of dye that you can get from this plant. And it had really hard seeds. Look at the Latin name, lithospermum. Litho means rock, and spermum means seed. So the seeds are as hard as rocks, and the Indians used them as sacred beads. It had many medicinal uses. I like the idea of the contraceptive. As it turns out, they tested it on mice, and it works. It contains an estrogen-like compound. So there is a scientific reason that it probably worked. So the oldest shoes ever found are made out of a prairie plant called the rattlesnake master. And here's another orange dot. So this is one that we know used to grow at our cemetery. We haven't found it yet, but we're still looking. Every year we find some new things. So those shoes are 8,000 years old. The Indians had stories about the plants, often with a lesson for the younger folks. The story here is the plants used to grow underground. I don't know if you knew that. Plants used to grow underground. And then they decided one day we're going to try growing above the ground. And so one by one they would try, and it was cold and windy, and they'd get killed. Everyone that came up would get killed. And finally the prairie rose said, well, let me give it a try. And the prairie rose came up, and it was so beautiful, and it smelled so nice. The wind fell in love with it. And so ever since that day, Mother Earth has been covered with a garment of flowers. So there was a brave that was in love with a maiden, and she didn't like him too well. And he said, "Will you be mine?" And she's like, "I don't know about this." And he said, "If I shoot one of the stars out of the heavens, will you be mine?" She thought, "Well, that's safe enough. Yes." So everybody gathered, and he got his bow and arrow out, and he shot an arrow up into the sky. Come on. And everything went black, and you couldn't see anything. And then eventually it got light, and that brave has never been seen since. But where he stood, this shooting star that he shot out of the sky, it sits there on our prairie. The first Europeans to come through our area in 1673 would be Marquette and Joliet, with two L's. The town of Joliet is named, there's Romeoville and Juliet, and then they eventually changed Juliet to Joliet with one L. I told you there'd be some history, right? So, this is Marquette. We had never seen anything like this river for the richness of the soil, the prairies, the woods, the animals, and all that. So the explorers were really impressed with the prairie. The Indians, remember, lived with it and knew it. They were fine with it. The explorers, good. Now, why did that not show up? This Marquette drew a map in 1673, and he proposed a canal. It didn't get built till 1840s. And I found that map at the Library of Congress. Someone didn't show up here. So in 1721, Pierre de Liette said, "The Illinois country is undeniably the most beautiful it is known anywhere between the mouth of the St. Lawrence and that of the Mississippi, which are 1,000 leagues apart." So, okay, this is a great place. So Thomas Jefferson sends James Monroe out to Illinois to see what it looks like out there. Are we going to make a state out of that? And he said, "No, it's miserably poor. It won't even grow trees, won't even grow bushes, just miserably poor. If you're going to make a state, we need to make it big because there's never going to be very many people out here in Illinois." So Illinois was settled from the south by the French. The town of Prairie du Rocher, or Prairie of the Rock, prairie is a French word, it means meadow, settled in the south. And 100 years later, only the southern part of the state is settled. And we became a state in 1818. So there's nothing up here in what's northern Illinois. That was Indian territory. And in eastern Illinois is called the Grand Prairie. And there were no trees, so it's like hard to build your log cabin. So scientists have kind of reconstructed how much prairie we would have had in 1820. So everything in this kind of a yellowish orange color is prairie. That would be 22 million acres of prairie, and the green is forest. And notice where the forest is, southern Illinois, and along the rivers, and some at northern Illinois. Now, I saw that map on the right one time, and it's totally fascinated me. I just really got into this. It turns out, you see all those, Franklin County down south there on the left-hand map, see those little orange spots? They named those prairies. That's the first place you wanted to settle, and they named those prairies. In the north, we named our groves. In the north, we named those green spots, because that's where you would want to settle. If you had a lot of woods and a little bit of prairie, you wanted to settle in the prairie because you didn't have to cut down the trees to plow the land. But if you were in northern Illinois, you didn't want the prairie, you needed some trees. So here is Franklin County down south, and you have, I can hardly see the map from here, Long Prairie and all those little prairies. So I did a study of a bunch of counties. I'm only going to show you a couple of them. And Franklin County has all those named prairies. Now, they may not still have that name. And the only grove I could find, there's one grove down in the corner. Now, I'm from Kane County. So Kane County has a bunch of groves named, and I grew up in Sugar Grove, which is down at the bottom center. And the only prairie names I could find, we have a place called Bald Mound. So I would say that must have been a prairie on top of this gravelly hill. And we have an old cemetery called the Prairie Cemetery. That's all I can find so far in Kane County. Now, my pointer isn't strong enough to reach there, but you can see on the left Lone Grove. That's a forest preserve today. It's still a grove. And I mentioned Sugar Grove. Big Grove still exists. Part of it's by Fermilab, and there's a forest preserve by that name. And Nelson's Grove is now called Nelson Lake, but there's still the trees there. And so we have I live in Elburn now, which our first post office is called Lance's Grove. And then they named it Melbourne, but then they already had a Melbourne, so they said they couldn't use Melbourne, so let's, what do we do? Oh, drop the M, call it Elburn. So there's no other Elburn anywhere. McClure's Grove is Dundee. There's a Round Grove Cemetery in St. Charles and so forth. So DuPage County has a bunch of groves. The only prairie I could find was what is now called Plainfield Road, and I guess Plainfield sort of refers to prairie. And a lot of these places have changed their name. Meacham's Grove is Bloomingdale, and Dunkley's Grove is Addison, and Downers Grove, they don't use the apostrophe anymore. Cook County, since you're close to Cook County, I thought I would throw this one in. I've got a bunch of other counties, but I just put a couple of them in here. Cook County had a few prairies, and but quite a few groves. And the Franzosian bush means Frenchman's woods, where the Germans settled. Don't ask me. So, 1830, they had negotiated with the Indians, to get that green strip where they could build that canal. When they eventually did build that canal, the Illinois-Michigan Canal. Then that yellowish, that was Indian territory. And over on the left was settled because the government gave land to Revolutionary War soldiers. If they would go there and settle, they could have free land. So the government's had their handouts forever, right? So the Indians sort of signed with their ex several treaties and gave up all the land. And the most recent treaty was this one I found in the National Archives between the Chippewa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomis. And they had to be out of here by 1835. That would be other side of the Mississippi River by 1835. I'm sorry, not Chief, Black Hawk, I don't think it was an actual chief. He said, I didn't sign that. And you ripped off these people. You got a bunch of people to sign it, got them drunk and have them sign the thing. And that's not the way the Indians work. We have more like a democracy. Everybody gets a vote. You can't just pick a few people and say, I'm going to give you something here, like some liquor, have you put your X on here. So he said, I'm going to get everybody with me and take that land back. Well, that didn't work out for him. He did win the first battle, though, and the cemetery is in, or the Stillman's defeat is out western Illinois, and they sent the best Indian fighter they had, General Winfield Scott, and he had to cut his own road to get out there, which we today call Army Trail Road. And then we've named a town for him, Winfield, sorry. And he ran for president and lost. So 1830s, Cyrus McCormick invents the reaping machine, and that's really not good for the prairie because now they can farm bigger areas, plow up more of the prairie. So 1835 is when the first settlements occur west of the Fox River. Sometimes I'm getting two pictures go at once. There's the other one I'm looking for. So in 1835, a bunch of these places out in Kane County. In 1836. Now I looked up DuPage County, and I guess you had some settlers in 1830 near Lisle, and then the Napers, or actually Napier, they changed the spelling, in 1831, and all the wooded land was claimed by 1837. Then you had to settle out on the prairie in the dregs of what's left, like Darien. So you couldn't settle until, you could settle, but you couldn't own the land until it was surveyed. So you were a squatter, and it was legal to be a squatter, but you couldn't own it. So then the surveyors came through on a mile square. They surveyed it, and they put some posts down at the corners and at the halfway point. So we set the quarter section corner post from which a bur oak, 12-inch diameter, bearing such and such a degrees and such a distance. So from the point, to find that point again when you bought the land, it was 30 feet northeast to a bur oak, 12-inch diameter. Those were called bearing trees or witness trees. Goes when I don't want it to. So the bottom one, the corner of these four sections, land, the prairie, level and rich, fit for cultivation, the timbered land, level and rich, fit for cultivation, timber, bur oak and white oak, undergrowth hazel. So hazel was a very common undergrowth tree. It's not common today at all. So I put a picture of hazelnut. Beautiful shrub. So this is in Cook County, this is a Westchester. And those squares are the mile square, and that would have been surveyed on those squares. And they marked the corners and the halfway point, and then people made maps from those surveyors' notes. And they noted when they crossed the stream, when they moved into the prairie, when they were in the woods, and so forth. So a lot of what we know about the prairie comes from these notes. And I want to point out, if your stream runs north and south, like we saw earlier in the Fox River, there's more woods on the east side. That's because the prairie fire is being blown by the wind from the west, and so there's a lot more woods on the east side. But if your creek is running east and west, then you get woods on both sides. Well, now, Wolf Road Prairie is in this picture, but my pointer isn't working, so. So somebody recently figured out where all these witness trees were, and they put it on the internet. And you see the map of the Illinois with all those dots, those were the witness trees. So I said, well, let's check out Darien. You didn't have any witness trees. Why would that be? Because it was prairie. It was prairie. Now, a little bit south, there are some witness trees along these roads, which would be a mile apart. Those are probably all gone because the road is there. There might be one in Argonne. That one could still be there. So people are out looking for these now, and I've found a couple of them. So if you were out west where there weren't any trees, you would build your house out of sod and hope it doesn't rain. This is a sod house you can visit in South Dakota. It's got a wooden roof and sod walls. You needed your trees for fences, for fuel, for log cabins. You just really, out on the prairie with no trees was tough. The prairie had no wood, no stone. Can't build it. It was wet, hard to plow, hot sun, wind, fire, and blood-feeding flies. Some people traveled at night because these flies could kill your horse in the daytime. So if you live in a log cabin, and, oh look, isn't that interesting? So that was a problem. So what would you do? You would hunt for a grove of trees. So you would settle in a grove. I mentioned Sugar Grove, but you guys know Long Grove, Buffalo Grove, Glen Ellen, which was Babcock's Grove. So you'd settle those groves in northern Illinois. Like Pingree Grove, where the prairies meet the oaks. The plow you brought from out east would not literally cut it. So the blacksmiths started trying to improve the plow, and the first one was in near Joliet. He didn't patent it, and he never built a large number of them. His kids patented something about it, but a more famous man was John Deere, and he didn't patent it either, but he invented a way to make them in quantity, and he patented the machinery to make them in quantity. And you still know of John Deere today. And you can go visit his home out in Grand Detour. And there's a replica of his first one in the center. And interestingly, just coincidentally, I guess, his plow from 1837, that was the same year the last wild bison was in Illinois, in Troy Grove, another grove. So a couple of his original plows are still in existence. So one of them's in the Smithsonian in the National Museum of American History, and you can see a copy of it out in Moline, Illinois. Now, breaking the prairie was a big deal. It took huge teams of oxen or horses. Breaking the prairie was the most beautiful, the most epical, the most hopeful, and as I look back on it, in one way, the most pathetic thing man ever did. For in it, one of the loveliest things ever created began to come to its predestined end. Here's somebody with 2 oxen and 2 horses, and if you didn't have that, you could have the women pull the plow. There's actually a story to that. These are, I forget where they were from. They didn't believe that you should make animals do things for people. That was their belief. So you had to pull the plow yourself. You want to plow, it was not fair to make animals do it. So it wasn't just. So they didn't have fences either. So in the early days, you just let the cattle run wild. And then kind of got to be a problem. How do you find, no, that's your, no, that's my cow, you know. So we need a fence. And so they tried different things, like the zigzag fence. That uses way too much wood, the zigzag. And so they eventually settled on the Osage orange, and you still see some of these lines of trees out in the country, which have grown up big now, but when they were little, they're full of thorns, and that was their fence in the old days. Now, Northern Illinois, they've pretty much torn those out, but there's still a few around. So Glidden and DeKalb patented a better way to make barbed wire and got rich. So that's 2 Illinois inventions, plus the reaper. I mean, he lived in Chicago, McCormick. So Illinois invented all the ways to get rid of the prairie. So then they could fence the prairie, and then we dug ditches everywhere to lower the water table and get that water out of here so we could plant things and let those guys downstream worry about it. So a lot of Illinois is now in Louisiana. So they straightened our creeks, made ditches out of them. That turned Illinois into corn land and bean land. But our soil is eroding away because we don't have the prairie roots holding it in place. So it's blowing away and washing away. Out west, it's blowing away. In Illinois, it's mostly washing away. We've lost half of our topsoil in 150 years. That was in 1993. So now we're working on the other half. So at that rate, we had another 150 years. Now the farmers are doing better today. They've slowed it down, but we're still losing more topsoil than they lost in the Dust Bowl. We think it was bad in the Dust Bowl. We're losing more now. Now, what I love to do is go to old cemeteries and notice the slope to get to the cemetery or the drop-off. That's how much soil we have lost. These old cemeteries have the original soil and then the farmland next to it. So these are just cemeteries, not prairies, but the same story holds if you can find a prairie. Here's 2 prairies. You can see the drop-off, the prairie on the left, in the left-hand picture, and the prairie is on the right. in that other picture, and we're losing about 2 millimeters a year. Okay, we said prairie was a grassland. Let's take a look at grasses for a minute. 2/3 of the prairie is underground that we don't even see. There are different kinds of grasses depending if it's a dry prairie, a medium prairie, or a wet prairie. We won't go into all that now, but I've arranged these from dry to wet. So starting with the driest prairie, or these and then getting a little bit wetter. And there's our big blue stem. And dropseed is grown as an ornamental a lot. It's such a pretty grass. Got that shot from downtown Chicago. And then switchgrass, that can absorb 8 inches of rain per hour. So instead of having a flood, it just soaks into the ground. And then get into the really wet prairies, cordgrass and blue joint grass. The prairie has had to put up with drought, sun, wind, frost, and fire. So a lot of plants would be killed by those things. So the prairie plants have evolved special characteristics to handle that. So deep roots. Many of the prairie plants have deep roots. The grasses have wind pollination since there's plenty of wind out in the prairie. They don't have petals on their flowers. Petals just get in the way. Petals are to attract insects. You don't need petals. You just need those anthers and pistils. Narrow leaves. Narrow leaves help from evaporating all the moisture. So if it's dry, narrow leaves help. If it's really dry, cactus. But we're not that dry. The top violet is a common everyday violet with the round leaves, and the bottom two are prairie violets, and you can see the divided leaf, divided into sections. There's a few more things with narrow leaves. Many of the prairie plants have narrow leaves. Even a divided leaf. And these plants, these leaves are like Venetian blinds. I can tilt these leaflets to, get out of the wind and the sun. Many prairie plants are fuzzy, downy. This one doesn't grow right around here. You have to go out around Rockford to find the nearest place to find those. Here's two more, fuzzy or hairy, very common. Now, what that does is it traps a little moisture around the stem, and it reflects some of the sunlight. On the left is a prairie phlox, and on the right is a wetland phlox, and you see the wetland phlox doesn't have any hairs on it like the prairie one does. Another thing you could do is just be tough, be rugged, and you don't wilt easily like all those wimpy little woodland wildflowers that will wilt on you, but these guys are tough, and they don't wilt. Wild quinine was used as a medicinal, to cure malaria, and we've already seen rattlesnake master. Another thing is sticky sap. Instead of a real watery sap that would just evaporate, if you have a sticky sap like spiderwort or the milkweeds, there's a whole bunch of milkweeds out on the prairie. Common milkweed is really kind of weedy, but there's all kinds of unweedy milkweeds out there. And then we have some really tough plants. There's 3 silphiums in our state. One is rosinweed. It has this rosin gum in it. And prairie dock also. Now this one didn't read the book about having the narrow leaves. It has really big elephant ears, it's called sometimes. But they point straight up in the air, so they don't get the full sunlight. So by pointing straight up, they get by, whereas if they were flat, they couldn't be that big. But a very close relative does have divided leaves. That's the compass plant, and that one grows much farther west because it does have the divided leaves. This one has all of the above. It has deep roots, has fuzzy stem, has divided leaves, has coarse, tough foliage, and sticky sap. Did I forget anything? It's got everything you need. Great prairie plant. Now there's a little insect that cuts the flowers off. It's called a silphium weevil, and it cuts the flowers off, and it lays eggs in that dying flower, and the flower is going to eventually fall off, land on the ground, and the little baby weevil is going to crawl out and get into the ground and grow there till he eventually grows up and goes off and finds his own silphium. You can see him on the right. It's the little guy. You've heard of the cotton boll weevil. This is not anywhere near the economic, problem of the cotton. This is the lesser of the two weevils. So nobody is settling in the Grand Prairie in eastern Illinois because there's really no rivers, there's no stone, and it's a terrible place. So the government says we got to get people there. So let's give the railroad 2.5 million acres of land if they will build a train track the full length of the state. That'll be the Illinois Central, later Illinois Central Gulf. And so here they are selling 2 million, and you use that money that they made to build the railroad, which was, I think, the longest railroad in the country at the time. And I was hired one time, this is my partner I worked with, to find prairie along the Illinois Central Gulf. And there was still some prairie there. We had to look for endangered species, wetlands, and prairies in case they ever want to widen that so we could have a high-speed train to St. Louis. That's not happening very fast. Pardon?
Did that railroad originally run from Chicago to St. Louis?
I don't remember where it started. Anybody know where that started? Chicago wasn't much of a place back then. Pardon? Yeah, I think it goes through Champaign, and it goes all the way south. I don't know where it goes at the north. Yeah, but we're on the other end. Anyway, so I live in Elburn, and this is near Elburn, but a few years ago, in 2005, they widened that, so you can now take the train to Elburn, and the cost was the prairie was destroyed, which is the story everywhere. There's always something better you can do with the prairie. And then these railroads go broke, and so we make prairie paths. That was the first one in the nation, but we have a lot of those now, old railroad tracks, so you might find some prairie along those. Here's one near my house. A friend of mine had my Piper Cub. He took me up, took the picture on the left, and you can see the former railroad track. It's now a bike trail, and there's a little section between the arrows has original prairie. And then off the top of the picture is the one on the right. So between a highway on the right, Route 64, and the bike trail, you just have a nice little prairie there. This one was too rocky and steep to plow. They did take some gravel out of the side of it, you can see there, but that's original prairie, and the Forest Preserve bought the whole farm to save that little bit of prairie. The biggest of those, and really the nicest one, is in Rockford, called Harlem Hills, right in Rockford. And it's quite a large prairie. I was just there yesterday. This one you couldn't plow. I'll let you figure out why this was hard to plow. This one, also hard to plow. It's rocky, very little topsoil. The beer can is to hold the rock in place. But look at the wildflowers in that rocky place. Then there's wet prairies, places that were too wet to plow along this creek, both sides of the creek. This one is in Elgin, and it has the top two pictures are a dry gravel prairie, and the bottom two are a wet prairie. One on the right is called a fen. It's an alkaline wet prairie. So this has quite a variety in that one area. Now, one of my favorites is the Depression. Some of our prairies were subdivided, and then the Depression hit. And so this one was halfway between Chicago and Milwaukee, called Shiwaukee Prairie, and it goes from the state line on up to Kenosha. And on the south side in Illinois connects up to Illinois Beach State Park. I think 1,000 lots. And the conservation has been buying those lots for 50 years. And we're down to the last 50 or 100 someplace in there. We buy about 3, 4, 5 a year. So we're getting there after 50 years. I'm going to go see that one tomorrow. And it is interesting. It either doesn't go or it moves too fast. It's so wet, and they thought they could build on this, but it's obviously wet prairie. And fabulous, fabulous place for shooting stars about this time of year. And in the summer, the wild lupin. So some spectacular shows of wildflowers. Then the Wolf Road Prairie near here was 597 lots in 80 acres. And I was with Save the Prairie Society, and all the lots with a little purple square around are ones we purchased. And now in the end, the state owns half of the prairie, and the County Forest Reserve owns half of it. Took us 20 years, but you can see those sidewalks. Sidewalks are still there. Go in off 31st Street, and you can walk on the sidewalk, and you won't even be wrecking the prairie or trampling on anything, just go on the sidewalk. Come on here. There's a Wolf Road Prairie shot. So right in the middle of the town. That's the Savannah Wolf Road Prairie. The square is 4 square miles. All of the virgin prairie in the state of Illinois would fit easily into that 4 square mile area. Come on. So the surveyors would have surveyed those squares. There is a prairie in this picture, but I should say, if you started with a $100 bill and spent $99.99, you had a penny left. That's what we did with our prairie. If our original 22 million acres was the $100 bill, what we got left is 1 penny. But there is a prairie in this picture at the arrow. It's a cemetery from 1846. And they didn't need the whole place for their graves. And so part of it survived. If you stay in the white man's old burial ground long enough, this darkness must come to you. His way of life is the land's death, and his way of death is the land's life. Written by a Native American, William Least Heatmoon. This is another one. It's an Illinois nature preserve called Beach Cemetery, named for the Beach family. Beautiful, beautiful spot. Which brings us to another cemetery that they didn't need the whole thing. So we have this church built in a little settlement called Lace. And then it has part of it never used as a cemetery, and that's our Prairie. And Debbie and Denise have chipped in a few of the pictures coming up here, and I've lost track of maybe of a couple of them of who it came from, but I want to give them credit for that. Now, you know the difference between a cemetery and a graveyard, right? Yeah, right. So if it's a church and the graves are in the yard, it's a graveyard. If there's no church, it's a cemetery. Today we use them interchangeably, but so in Darien here, we used to have a graveyard, but now we have a cemetery. Anyway, John Banaszak, a local teacher, discovered the Prairie in 1980, and he invited me there. I went in 1985 and took a few pictures, and I was busy with Wolf Road Prairie. I never went back. I forgot I even went there, found these old pictures. So that's John, and there's the Prairie. It's kind of fuzzy, but there's no shrubs, and it's full of shooting stars. I don't see any weeds. It's a little hard to tell. It's 65 species of prairie plants and no weeds. Either there weren't any weeds or he just didn't write them down. But it looks like there were hardly any weeds. So then he was sick for a few years and the prairie went downhill. But he did register it with the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission as a natural heritage landmark. That's because it's a, I don't know what it is, a half acre or something of the 22 million acres. So that it's an important step number one of preservation because it's recognized. Step two would be to make it a land and water reserve, but it's too small to qualify, so that's out. Step three would be to make it a nature preserve, which is the highest level of preservation, and nobody, you know, the city couldn't come in and say, oh, we need to put a gas line under here, or we need to, you know, whatever. That would really give it protection. But we have to get the quality back up to do that. There's another option that's called a conservation easement, where the church would still own it, but somebody else would have the right to build with somebody that wouldn't build. And so nobody could build on it because the church owns the land and the other people would own the building rights. So it wouldn't ever get built on. That's another kind of option. Anyway, so I found in 1939, I either pushed too hard or not hard enough. Come on. I found a 1939 aerial photo, and there's the cemetery, and it's all farmland around there, 1939. Then I went back on Google Earth, and you can back up, and I went back, and in 2002, you could see the prairie had a good clean burn. It's just all black. So it must not have been a bunch of shrubs and trees in there at that point. 2005, it still looks clean. 2012, it looks kind of shrubby. And then we got in there in the last couple of years and took the shrubs out, and the prairie is green where the rest of the cemetery is still brown because we burn it. So before, as we got started, the poison ivy was clear up in the trees. The sumac was taller than a person. Two kinds of sumac, Queen Anne's lace, and ragweed, and everything. And our folks here in the front row are grimacing. That's all the stuff we've been working on. I think it skipped a picture. Maybe not. So the top is our burn crew. So it's, E.J. Neefsey is in the middle there, and he just comes once a year, but that's a very crucial role he plays. It leads our burn. And then there's the rest of our crew here, Kristen with her chainsaw, and some of the other people that are out there cutting the weeds, collecting seeds, distributing the seeds around. We work all through the growing season. And then we had a couple that have moved away, but I wanted to give them credit. As Mark even wrote our theme song, which the group will sing for you after we're done here. It's O Buckthorn to the tune of O Tannenbaum. So here's what a workday looks like. You know, we've gone through hundreds of these bags of weeds and brush and everything. And it always goes twice when So we're fighting the periwinkle and the daylilies, the sweet clover and the buckthorn, and some of the trees, even some garden flowers like irises, and some native shrubs like blackberries and sumac. They're native, but they're weedy natives that we have to get rid of or the prairie disappears. So you can see some of the problem areas. Skip over. Okay. I wanted to talk about fire just a little bit. Fire is crucial to the prairie because it kills off weeds. And the prairie is living underground, basically. The growth tip of a tree is a tip, and the growth of a prairie is at ground level. So you burn off the top, but it comes right back. So the fire is really important to us. And then our group said, we're getting the prairie shaped up, but the cemetery is a mess too. Why don't we clean it up while we're at it? So we've had a lot of our work days clearing out all the brush and weeds and everything from the rest of the cemetery besides the prairie. And we all bring our lunch and sit around and chat, or we have a little tour of what's in bloom or whatever, and we get together in the wintertime, so you can join us. There are some of the grasses we have out there, and these pictures now are actually from the prairie. They won't have the yellow dots on them. So we have grasses, we have flowers, Indian potato, strawberries, all kinds of flowers all season long, spring, summer, fall flowers. Shooting stars, wild onions. We talked about all three of these earlier. These are the three silphiums that are found in prairies, and we have all three of them out there in small quantities. So we collect the seeds and spread them around and try to get them to spread. And we have a thistle out there. There are bad thistles, and then there's some good thistles. And we have a good thistle. The birds love it. A hummingbird, goldfinch. We have all kinds of butterflies out there. People get excited about the monarch, but there's all kinds of other butterflies. And what do butterflies need? They need flowers. Where you get flowers? Prairies. So it's a great spot for butterflies. And it surprised me, it's a great spot for dragonflies because there's other insects to eat. And dragonflies, babies, are aquatic. And so we must have clean water nearby. Well, that's a good sign too. So we have a number of kinds of dragonflies. Praying mantis is not native. There's a native one farther south in Illinois, but the one we have around here is the Oriental, but it's cool anyway. But, you know, so it's big front legs. We have, and that's from the prairie, but we have something else. We have a little bug called an ambush bug, and it has big, strong front legs. It's just a little guy, but it has strong front legs. And it hides on a flower and waits and ambushes whoever comes walking by, some other insect, and they'll reach out and grab it. So that was pretty cool to find. We have honeybees, but honeybees are not native, so I didn't put them in here. But we have a bunch of native bees also. So there's just 3 different native bees, bumblebees. We have 3 kinds of grasshoppers, we have beetles. The upper left is an interesting one. It's a little spider called a crab spider, and they can change color, and they match their background, and they hide, and they catch bees, which are way bigger than they are. Then Denise was poking her shovel one day and trying to dig out some bad thing, and she hit a rock. And what is the rock doing here? And she poked around a little more, and it feels like it's flat. Shouldn't be, rocks aren't flat. So we dug up a little bit, and that's the foundation stone of the original church. So we poked around. We didn't dig anymore, but we poked around. We put flags. That's the outline of the original church that we were able to locate. So that was kind of fun. That was our big event of the year. Then there was some broken glass in there too. So Denise took the pieces home and put them together and was able to figure out one is a ball jar from the 1800s and one was a beer bottle also from the 1800s from Joliet. So those Lutherans, I don't know. So the Historical Society has an annual event at the cemetery, and so we joined in that, and there's Eileen in her work clothes over there as part of that tour, and then we added a stop on the tour to see the prairie. So in addition to learning about the pioneers and their stories, you can learn about the prairie on that tour. Okay, these are 2 of our rarest flowers we have. We had just a couple of gentians, beautiful plants, and we're expanding them. We're up to like 6 or something, waiting to see this year what we get. And we have 1 orchid. So we're hoping we get the orchid back. Now this is what plant nerds look like. We're really excited about that thistle. And I had a picture of it from 1985. This thistle is called Hill's thistle. It's a beautiful thistle and had beautiful seeds. And I didn't know it at the time, but it blooms once and dies. So it's like an annual, only it lives a bunch of years. And then it flowers and dies. And so we collected the seeds and spread them around. Now we have yet to know whether anything grew. But that's a very rare thistle in the first place, and then the fact that it blooms and dies, and then we have to wait for the next generation. Who knows? It could be another 20 years before we see another one. I don't know. There are some animals in the prairie. We do not have bison there yet. Maybe next year. Last wild bison in Illinois was 1837. They were reintroduced in 2014. There's a rare prairie snake, a rare prairie frog, a rare prairie turtle, and an endangered or threatened box turtle, none of which we have. Our place is too small. There are some prairie birds. Our place is way too small. but there are birds that require prairie in large expanses. Prairie fire was quite a scene. And scary. Our fires are not that big. And that's Corn Farm, Denise, and Snow represent. So pretty good sized fire. Ours is just a small fire. Now, the fire burns off the top, but the prairie, and the idea is to get rid of the shrubs. And the prairie will grow back, like 2 weeks later, it greens up. And people worry about the animals. Here's a frog that survived the prairie fire. He's got a little soot on him. But the fire is not hot at ground level. It's hot an inch above the ground. But if you're small enough to be right down there, snakes and frogs and things, they're not killed by the prairie fires. Okay, come on here. Now what the fire does is it recycles a lot of things, the ashes and everything, puts the minerals back, but the nitrogen escapes. So the prairie is short of nitrogen. But the prairie has another strategy. It's full of legumes, the ones that take the nitrogen out of the air and put it in the soil. And those plants enrich the soil and put back what the fire took out. There's only one tree that can stand up to the prairie fire, and that's a bur oak. It has thick bark, can stand up to the prairie fire. I always spell it with the 2 R's the old way, but a lot of people know it's 1 R. There's one strategy I didn't mention. You got the deep roots and all that stuff. The other strategy would be to get in there early before the competition gets there, bloom, and get out of there. So we have a bunch of spring flowers that are little low-growing things, and they disappear when the taller flowers come in. So that's another strategy. In the summer, it looks like this, taller. In the fall, get the grasses turning color and the compass plant. We have all 3 of these kinds of asters. And we have 1 of these 4 kinds of gentians. Other prairies have other kinds of gentians. It's kind of everybody's favorite. The winter, don't forget to visit prairie in the winter. Today, people are digging up those tile lines and putting the water back into the land. Digging up tiles. We are planting prairie plants. How many of you have prairie plants in your yard or your garden? Like half the group here. So people are growing these plants. And the detention basins, they surround them with prairie plants now. There's a neighbor that has a prairie, and his other neighbor has a lawn. We had that drought in 2012, and the prairie was fine. This is my house on the left, so futuristic solar panels, and my past is like my prairie. So I got the past and the future both here. And my favorite visitor is the hummingbird clearwing moth. He didn't even know I was there, and I could take as many pictures as I wanted of the clearwing moth. But people are planting prairies along highways sometimes, or around libraries and different places. Prairie plants can be medicinal, edible. There are some very rare endangered species out on the prairie that need protecting. We worry today about the climate change and the CO2. The prairie plants can take the CO2 out of the air. Take the CO2 out of the air and put it in the ground. Trees can do that too, but in some conditions, the prairie is better. Of course, everybody loves the butterflies. Well, we got to save the prairie if we want to save the butterflies. Or just a place to get out and walk. Get out by yourself and walk around and enjoy nature. I'm going to close with a romantic poet, William Cullen Bryant, in the 1830s, came out to visit the prairie. He said, "These are the gardens of the desert. These the unshorn fields, boundless and beautiful, for which the speech of England has no name." The prairies. So put down some roots, plant prairie, and I am with Sandberg, oh prairie mother, I am one of your boys. Thank you. Might have time for a couple of questions. Everybody wants to get to the cake. Question?
You said with a sticky sap, how does that help the prairie plants?
What's that?
You said there were some prairie plants that adapted survival with a sap, like a sticky sap.
How
does
they
that
adapt?
with a sap, S-A-P? Didn't you say?
Oh, the sap.
Yeah, how does that?
Oh, the question is, how does the sap help them? And if you have a watery sap, the dry wind blows in and it just dries up the plant, it wilts and dies. But if you have a sticky sap, it's not watery, so it's not going to dry up. It's like your garden, you know, a lot of things, if you don't water things, they dry up. Well, if it had sticky sap, it can be dry out, but it won't dry out. Yeah, good question. Good one.
If you were to start a prairie in your backyard, you know, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, if you were to start a prairie or a meadow in your backyard, for instance, what would be the plant that you would start with as like your anchor and then like build the other plants around it? Or would you just mow it down, till it over, and start with everybody? What would be the
The question is, what would you start with? And I started with when I moved to my site, my old neighbors gave a present of a kit, a flat of prairie plants from Prairie Moon Nursery, and they picked out what it was. One of them is way too aggressive, the Golden Alexanders, but you would want to start with a few grasses. I mean, grasses are crucial to the prairie, and butterfly weed is about as pretty as flowers get, so I would probably put some butterfly weed in. We can talk later. Denise has just designed a little tiny little garden for a library, historical society, right? For the historical society, and she had to pick out a very small number of plants because it was a very small, and so she could give you some thoughts on that. Anything else?
How do sedges fit into the scheme of things? Sedges.
Sedges?
Yeah. Are they prairie plants as well?
Yeah, question is about sedges. Sedges are kind of like grasses with a different flower structure and a triangular stem instead of a round stem. But there are more sedges in the Chicago region than any other kind of a plant, but they're hard to tell apart. But some of them are prairie sedges, but some are woodland sedges, some are wetland sedges, some are fence, so they have their own special requirements. But we have what do we have out at our prairie? We have about 4 different sedges, I guess. 2 of them are really restricted to prairie, and 2 are not quite so fussy, I think. So they're definitely a part of it, and they will support the fire. So without grasses and sedges, you can't keep a fire lit. The fire will just go out. So if you're doing this at home and you want to burn it, that house I showed you with the prairie on the roof, she burns it right up to the house. I don't know how she does it. I just cut mine off. I didn't burn it. I tried burning it a little tiny bit, and I thought, yeah, the neighbors are not going to like this, maybe. But you can burn it, or mow it, or get a bison. That helps. The prairie is especially rich if you have the bison, because they eat the grass, and when the grass is eaten, it likes to grow back, and so you have fresh, young shoots. And cattle will do that too, but the cattle don't keep moving like the bison. But yeah, that actually helps your prairie if you could have bison, but most of us don't. Okay, we're going to hang around for a couple of minutes here and have some of that cake out there. I assume that's for us. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but anyway, so we can talk some more if you have some more questions, and thank you, and let's enjoy it.